She was 19 and had been cast out. She had no family, no prospects, and a purse that held just £2 and 10 shillings. And with 1 sovereign of that meagre sum, she bought a ruin on a windswept hill in Northumberland. They called it Blackwood Fell, a skeleton of a castle forgotten by all. But what nobody knew, what the solicitor who sold it to her for a pittance did not suspect, was that, hidden deep within its crumbling chapel crypt, was a treasure that would not only change her life, but rewrite the history of the Vane family itself. Settle in and stay close with us for this one. We are so glad you are here. Margaret Vane's life had been shaped by 2 men and 1 woman. The first man was her father, Thomas Vane, the younger son of a younger son, a gentle scholar who cared more for Roman Britain than for the London society his dwindling inheritance might have afforded him. He had raised Margaret in a quiet country house in Sussex, surrounded by books and the scent of old paper and beeswax. He taught her to read not from primers, but from his own careful transcriptions of Bede, and to count by calculating the logistics of a Roman legion. From him she inherited a quiet nature, and a mind that saw patterns in things others overlooked. Her most treasured possession was a small, exquisitely carved wooden wren, its head cocked as if listening, that he had whittled for her 7th birthday. It was the last gift he ever gave her. He caught a fever of the lungs that autumn, and was gone by Christmas, leaving Margaret at 12, alone with a house, a name, and debts she did not understand. The second man was the solicitor, who managed the estate and explained with dry precision that her father's passing had triggered the terms of a marriage settlement. The house was not hers. It belonged now to Amelia, the wife her father had married a mere year before his death, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper ambition. Amelia saw Margaret not as a daughter but as a relic of a life she wished to erase, a quiet, observant girl who did not fit into her plans for remarriage and social ascent. This brought Margaret to the woman who shaped her, Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a widow in her late 50s, with hands gnarled from work but a touch as gentle as falling snow. Mrs. Gable had served Margaret's father for 20 years. Seeing the girl's precarious position, she took it upon herself to arm Margaret not with Latin or history, but with something far more valuable: competence. "A lady knows how to direct her staff," Mrs. Gable would say, her voice low and firm. "A woman knows how to do it all herself, in case the staff disappears." And so, in the years between her father's death and her eventual ejection, Margaret learned. She learned to take an inventory, her neat script filling ledgers with lists of linens, plates, and pantry goods. She learned to tell good wool from shoddy, to unpick a seam, and resew it so the mend was stronger than the original cloth, and to patch a sheet with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She learned how to make lye soap in a great copper pot in the wash-house, the acrid smell stinging her nose as she stirred the caustic mixture until it thickened. She learned to keep accounts, balancing expenditures for coal and candles against the household allowance, her columns of figures as neat and orderly as a line of Roman soldiers. Mrs. Gable taught her that work was a form of dignity, and that a well-run house was a fortress against chaos. Margaret, quiet and methodical, absorbed it all, her father's gift for patterns finding new expression in the rhythms of domestic life. She found a strange comfort in the logic of it. A stain could be removed, a tear could be mended, a debt could be tallied, and, if one had the means, paid. These were certainties in a world that had become profoundly uncertain. She kept the little wooden wren in the pocket of her apron, its smooth, worn shape a constant, silent connection to the man who had loved her without condition. The end of her life at Somerton House came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet cruelty of a folded piece of paper. It was a Tuesday morning in late September of 1842. The air held the first crisp promise of autumn, and sunlight streamed through the morning room windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Her stepmother, Amelia, sat at the mahogany writing desk, a letter opener of polished ivory in her hand. She had slit open an envelope bearing the seal of a London law firm. She read it once, her lips a thin, firm line, and then a second time. She did not look at Margaret, who was standing by the window, polishing the silver tray from the morning's tea service. "Margaret," Amelia said, her voice as cool and smooth as the ivory in her hand. "I have received a letter from Mr. Abernathy. Your father's estate is at last fully settled." Margaret paused, her hand stilling on the silver. She felt a knot of cold dread tighten in her stomach. Amelia placed the letter flat on the desk, smoothing it with her palm. "As you know, this house and its contents were mine by the marriage settlement. The remainder of your father's personal assets, after the settling of his considerable debts, has been calculated. It is, I am afraid, a negligible sum." She finally lifted her eyes to meet Margaret's. There was no pity in them, only a distant administrative finality. "There is no provision for you in the will. Your father, it seems, assumed you would be cared for. An unfortunate oversight." Margaret said nothing. She simply stood, the polishing cloth limp in her hand, the scent of silver polish sharp in her nostrils. The silence in the room was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock, each second a small, sharp blow. "You are 19 now," Amelia continued, her gaze dropping back to the letter, as if the matter was already concluded. "Of an age to make your own way. I have been more than generous in keeping you here these past 7 years." She folded the letter with precise, sharp creases. "You will have until the end of the week to make your arrangements. I think that is sufficient." She rose from the desk, her silk dress rustling. She paused as she passed Margaret, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper that was more chilling than her earlier pronouncements. "A girl with your particularities would not suit the household I intend to keep. It is for the best." And then she was gone, leaving Margaret alone in the sunlit room with the ticking clock and the sudden, vast emptiness of her future. There were no tears. Crying felt like a luxury she could not afford. Instead, she went upstairs to her small room under the eaves. She took out her trunk, a simple wooden box her father had used for his university books. She began to pack with the methodical calm Mrs. Gable had taught her. She folded her 3 presentable dresses, her 2 work dresses, her underthings, and her spare stockings. She wrapped her father's books, a copy of Virgil and a book on the fortifications of Hadrian's Wall, in a spare chemise. She placed the wooden wren in a small velvet pouch. On Friday morning, a small valise and the trunk were waiting by the front door. Amelia did not come down to say goodbye. The cook, a woman Amelia had hired, pressed a small parcel of bread and cheese into her hand with a furtive, pitying glance. The solicitor had arranged for her remaining inheritance to be paid out, £2, 10 shillings and 4pence. It was placed in her hand in a small canvas bag. The weight of it was both terrifyingly small and the heaviest thing she had ever held. The front door of Somerton House closed behind her with a solid, definitive click. She did not look back. The journey north was a slow, grinding passage from one world to another. Margaret paid her fare for a seat on the mail coach heading towards York, the first leg of a journey whose final destination she did not yet know. She sat wedged between a portly wool merchant who smelled of damp tweed and mutton, and a farmer's wife whose basket of live chickens clucked and fussed at their feet. The coach rattled and swayed on the rutted roads, the constant motion a physical manifestation of her own inner turmoil. For the first 2 days, the landscape was familiar, the soft, rolling hills and tidy hedgerows of the south. But as they crossed the River Trent, the country began to change. The fields grew larger, bounded not by hedges but by dry stone walls that snaked over the land like ancient grey serpents. The gentle greens of Sussex gave way to the tougher, browner hues of moorland heather and bracken. The sky, too, seemed to change. the soft southern blue replaced by a vast, dramatic expanse of pearl gray, often heavy with the promise of rain. She watched the world through the coach's grimy window, a silent observer of her own displacement. She ate her bread and cheese sparingly, making it last for 2 days, and refilled her water flask at coaching inns where she was too shy and too worried about her dwindling funds to buy a hot meal. At night she dozed fitfully, her head bumping against the hard wooden frame of the coach, her dreams a chaotic mix of her father's quiet study and Amelia's cold, dismissive eyes. Her destination had been decided by a line in one of her father's books. He had been fascinated by the Roman frontier, by Hadrian's Wall, and had often spoken of Northumberland as a land of stone and history, a place where the past was not buried, but lay upon the surface of the earth. He had once traced the line of the wall on a map for her, his finger stopping at a place name. Blackwood Fell, he had murmured. A vein held it, once, long ago before the Troubles. It was a wisp of a memory, a half-forgotten story, but it was all she had. It was a direction. In York, she changed coaches, booking passage on a smaller, rougher cart bound for Newcastle, and from there, another to the market town of Alnwick. By the time she arrived, a week after leaving Sussex, she was bone-weary and chilled to the core. Her purse was lighter by more than £1. The air in Northumberland was different, sharper, smelling of coal smoke and the sea. The people's accents were broader, the vowels clipped and hard, and she felt more foreign here than she had anywhere else. From Alnwick, she found a local carter willing to take her the last 12 miles inland, towards the Cheviot Hills. As they traveled, the landscape became wilder still, the hills rising into bleak, beautiful fells, their slopes dotted with hardy sheep that stared as the cart rumbled past. The carter, a taciturn man named John, pointed with his whip. Rothley Village, miss. And up there, he gestured towards a high, dark ridge against the grey sky. That'll be the fell. Not up there, but stone and wind. He dropped her and her trunk at the crossroads by the village green, touched his cap and drove away, leaving her standing alone as a fine, persistent drizzle began to fall. She was 19 years old, with £1 and 8 shillings to her name, and she had arrived at the edge of the world. The acquisition of Blackwood Fell was a transaction born of absurdity and desperation. Margaret found the office of the local solicitor, a Mr. Hemlock, in a small, dark-fronted building just off the Rothley Village Green. The office smelled of damp paper, dust and decay, a scent she was coming to associate with the legal profession. Mr. Hemlock was a thin, elderly man with a perpetually surprised expression, who peered at her over the top of his spectacles as if she were a ghost. When she stated her name, Vane, his eyebrows rose a fraction higher. "A Vane," he said, his voice raspy. "We've not had a Vane in these parts for 100 years or more. Not since the last of the line sold the good land and moved south." He listened to her inquiry with a sort of weary patience. She did not have a claim, she explained. She simply knew the name of the place and wished to know its status. "Blackwood Fell," he rasped, a dry chuckle catching in his throat. "My dear girl, it is a ruin, a pile of stones. It hasn't been a place of habitation since the old pretender came through. The county lists it as an encumbrance. The title is a mess, the land is worthless for grazing, and the Crown long ago absorbed the profitable lands attached to it. It is nothing." Margaret's heart sank, but she persisted. "Is it for sale?" He blinked at her. "For sale? Who would buy it?" "I would," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have 1 sovereign." Mr. Hemlock stared at her for a full minute. Then he let out a long, slow sigh and began shuffling through a stack of deed boxes, muttering to himself. Madness. Utter madness. He finally produced a yellowed, brittle document. The legal ownership was indeed a tangle, but the physical ruin itself, the 1-acre plot upon which the castle stood, had been declared derelict property by the county magistrate 50 years prior. To clear it from the books, it could be sold to any party willing to assume the title for a nominal fee. 1 sovereign, he said, looking at her again. It will cost me more than that in paperwork, but it will settle the matter. Very well. The transaction was surreal. Margaret signed her name, Margaret A. Vane, on the transfer deed. She pushed her single precious gold sovereign across the dusty desk. In return, Mr. Hemlock gave her a copy of the deed and a large, rusty iron key. This belonged to the last steward a century ago, he said, dropping it into her palm. I doubt it opens anything that isn't already fallen down. The property is yours, Miss Vane. May God have mercy on your soul. With the key in her pocket and her trunk left in the solicitor's care, she walked the 1.5 miles up the track that led from the village to the fell. As she climbed, the wind grew stronger, pulling at her cloak and whipping strands of hair across her face. And then she saw it. Blackwood Fell was not so much a building as a scar on the landscape. It stood on a high, defensible bluff, a jagged crown of dark, weathered stone against the turbulent gray sky. A great curtain wall, 30 feet high in places, still encircled the summit, but it was breached in 2 places, great ragged gaps where tons of masonry had collapsed outwards. The gatehouse, a formidable twin-towered structure, was the most intact part, though its roof had partially fallen in and its great oak doors had long since rotted away. Beyond it, in the open bailey, the grass was knee-high and tangled with thistle and nettle. At its center rose the ghost of the keep, a hollow square of stone, its upper floors gone, open to the sky like a skull with its top sheared off. A small, roofless building to one side must have been the chapel. It was a place of profound and desolate silence, broken only by the cry of the wind and the distant bleating of sheep. It was ruin on a scale she could not have imagined. It was hers. She walked slowly through the gaping entrance of the gatehouse, her hand resting on the cold, damp stone. The sheer, breathtaking dereliction of it should have terrified her. It should have sent her running back to the village in tears. But as she stood in the overgrown bailey, the wind tearing at her, looking at the skeletal keep and the broken walls, she felt something else. It was the same feeling she'd had as a child, looking at a page of her father's chaotic notes and seeing the underlying order. This was not just a pile of stones. It had a grammar. It had bones. Mrs. Gable had taught her to mend, to clean, to restore order from chaos on a small scale. This was the same task, just written vastly, terribly larger. She had a key, a deed, and 7 shillings. It was a beginning. The first days at Blackwood Fell were a battle for survival. The wind was a constant, scouring presence, and the Northumberland drizzle was a fine, penetrating mist that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her immediate need was for shelter, a place out of the wind and rain. The keep was useless, a stone funnel for the weather. The other buildings were roofless skeletons. Only the gatehouse offered any hope. One of its 2 towers, the west one, was less damaged than the other. The ground floor was a single circular room about 15 feet across, with a collapsed fireplace and a gaping, unglazed arrow slit for a window. Crucially, however, most of the stone-vaulted ceiling was intact, though a section of the floor above had fallen through, leaving a pile of rubble and rotten timber in one corner. This would be her fortress. Her first task was to clear it. Using a piece of fallen roof slate as a makeshift shovel and her bare hands, she began hauling out the debris. It was back-breaking work. Her hands, softened by years of indoor tasks, were quickly scraped raw. Every muscle ached. But with each load of rubble she dumped outside, a small patch of the stone floor was revealed. She worked from dawn until dusk, fueled by a grim determination and the last of the cook's bread. At night she huddled in the driest corner, wrapped in her cloak, the heavy iron key clutched in her hand like a talisman. The silence was absolute, a deep, ringing emptiness that was unnerving after the constant rattle of the coach. She felt an acute, piercing loneliness. On the 3rd day, she made her discovery. She needed a fire, not just for warmth, but for morale. The fallen timbers in the gatehouse were riddled with rot and too damp to burn. She remembered the small, roofless chapel she had seen in the bailey. Perhaps, she thought, some of the old roof beams or choir stalls might have fallen inside, sheltered from the worst of the rain. She picked her way through the nettles and entered the ruined nave. The sky was its only roof. The floor was paved with large, uneven flagstones, green with moss and slick with damp. As she walked toward the chancel end, her foot struck a stone that shifted slightly under her weight, making a hollow, booming sound that was distinctly different from the solid thud of the others. She stopped, her heart suddenly beating faster. She knelt down, scraping away the moss and dirt with her fingers. The stone was a massive slab of granite, about 4 feet square, with the faint, eroded carving of a cross on its surface. It was a tombstone, set into the floor. She pushed on one edge. It moved again, scraping against its neighbors. There was a space beneath it. Her curiosity, the scholar's instinct inherited from her father, warred with a primal fear of disturbing the dead. But desperation won. She needed to know what was under there. She looked around the ruin and found a long, rusted iron bar, perhaps part of an old window grill. Using a smaller stone as a fulcrum, she wedged the bar into the crack and put her entire weight on it. For a moment, nothing happened. The bar bent under the strain. She gritted her teeth, her muscles screaming in protest, and pushed again. With a deep, groaning scrape of stone on stone, the slab tilted upwards, revealing a flight of steep, narrow stone steps leading down into darkness. A wave of cool, dry air, smelling of ancient dust and dry earth, washed over her. It was a crypt. Lighting one of her few precious tallow candles, she descended. The crypt was small, a single vaulted chamber, no larger than the room in the gatehouse. It was astonishingly dry and clean, and it was not empty. Against the far wall stood 2 large, iron-bound chests, their wood dark with age but perfectly sound. They were not coffins. They were traveling trunks, reinforced for security. They were locked, but beside them, lying on the stone floor, was a heavy, rust-eaten pry bar, left there as if for this exact purpose. It took all her strength, but she managed to force the lock on the first chest. The lid creaked open. The candlelight fell upon a dense packing of yellowed linen. She pulled a corner of the cloth away, and her breath caught in her throat. Beneath it was a gleam, a soft, rich glow of tarnished silver. It was not just a few items. The chest was filled to the brim with it. Heavy silver plates stacked in columns, ornate goblets wrapped in cloth, massive candelabra, serving platters, and intricately worked salt cellars. It was a fortune. Shaking, she turned to the second chest. This one was harder to open, its lock more stubborn. When it finally gave way, it revealed not silver, but bundles of documents wrapped in oilskin. And on top of them, a small leather-bound book and a sealed letter. The letter was addressed in a faded, archaic hand. "To whomever of my blood finds this." Her fingers trembled as she broke the wax seal. The letter was dated 1648. It was signed by one Sir Alistair Vane, the very ancestor her father had mentioned. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then the age of strife is past, and a true Vane has returned to Blackwood Fell. I write this with Cromwell's men scouring the north, and my own cousin Richard, having betrayed our family for favor with the parliamentarians. I have hidden the family plate here, not from our declared enemies, but from the enemy within my own house. Richard believes the silver was lost to a raid, but I have secured it for a future generation." He went on to explain that his cousin was plotting to seize the title and lands through false claims and legal trickery. "Therefore," the letter continued, "I have also placed within this chest the original royal charter of title for Blackwood, granted by King Henry the Fee, along with the deed of primogeniture that secures the line of succession through my younger brother, William, and his heirs. My cousin's claim is fraudulent. This document is the true proof of ownership, not only of this castle, but of the 3,000 acres of farmland and forest that surround it, Lands my treacherous cousin has already begun to sell off. I leave this here in hope. Hope that one day, a descendant of William's line, a person of true vain character, will find this and restore what was stolen. Guard it well. Use this wealth to rebuild these walls and reclaim your birthright. May God preserve you. Margaret sank to the floor of the crypt, the letter in one hand, the heavy sealed charter in the other. The candlelight flickered on the tarnished silver. 2 centuries of silence had just been broken. The treasure was not just the silver, it was the truth. The scholar's daughter held the proof. The cast-out girl had just inherited a kingdom. The discovery in the crypt changed everything. The gnawing anxiety of survival was replaced by the solid weight of purpose, a purpose 2 centuries in the making. Margaret spent the rest of that day in a daze of methodical activity, the shock giving way to the practical mindset Mrs. Gable had instilled in her. She was no longer a destitute girl. She was the custodian of a legacy. Her first act was one of security. She could not leave a fortune in silver sitting in an open crypt. With immense effort, she dragged the chests, one by one, from the crypt to her room in the gatehouse. She camouflaged the entrance to the crypt with rubble and loose stones, making the disturbed flagstone look like just another part of the chapel's ruin. The chests now sat in the darkest corner of her new home, silent and heavy with promise. The next morning she walked back to Rothley village. Her entire demeanor had shifted. Her shoulders were back. Her step was firm. She was no longer a supplicant. She was an employer. Her first stop was not the solicitor, but the nearest banking agent in Alnwick, a journey she made by hiring the swiftest horse and trap she could find. She deposited a single, heavy silver platter as collateral, opening an account under the name of the Blackwood Fell estate. The bank manager, seeing the quality of the plate, clearly 17th century, and of significant weight, treated her with a newfound respect. With access to capital, her plans could begin. She returned to Rothley and sought out the man the innkeeper had recommended as the best stonemason in the district, Mr. Silas Thompson. She found him in his yard, a man in his late 50s with a face as weathered as the stone he worked, surrounded by the dust of his trade. He was carving a headstone, and the tap-tap-tap of his chisel was a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. He listened to her request to assess and repair the gatehouse of Blackwood Fell. With a skeptical eye, his gaze taking in her youth and her simple, worn dress. "The old ruin," he said, his Northumbrian accent thick and slow. "Lass, that's not a repair job. That's a fool's errand. The place needs pulling down, not propping up." Margaret did not argue. She simply opened her new account book and placed 3 gold sovereigns on the dusty workbench between them. "This is for your initial survey and a week's labor," she said calmly. "More will follow as the work proceeds. I want the west tower of the gatehouse made sound and weatherproof before winter. Can you do it?" Mr. Thompson stopped his work. He looked from the coins to her face, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He saw the resolve in her eyes. He picked up one of the sovereigns, bit it, and then a slow smile spread across his craggy face. "Aye," he said, a new respect in his voice. "The stone up there is good whinstone, hard as iron. The bones of the place are sound. Aye, Miss Vane, I can do it." The next day, the rebuilding began. Mr. Thompson arrived with his apprentice, a strong lad named Ben, and a cart laden with ladders, ropes, and tools. The quiet ruin was filled with the sounds of work, the scrape of trowels, the clang of hammers on stone, the shouted instructions from the roof. Margaret did not stand by and watch. She worked alongside them. She cleared rubble, hauled buckets of water from a stream at the base of the fell, and learned from Mr. Thompson how to mix lime mortar to the perfect consistency. He taught her the logic of stone, how to read a wall for stress and weakness, how to set a new stone so it knitted seamlessly with the old. She was a quick and tireless student, her small frame belying a surprising strength. They started with the roof, stripping away the remaining rotten timbers and broken slates. New oak beams, purchased from a timber merchant in Alnwick, and hauled up the fell by a grumbling but well-paid carter, were hoisted into place. Under Mr. Thompson's direction, Margaret learned to lay new Welsh slates, overlapping them in neat watertight rows, nailing them down with copper nails that would not rust. It was hard, satisfying work under the vast open sky. As she hammered each slate into place, it felt as if she were not just rebuilding a roof, but reassembling the scattered pieces of her own life, making it strong and secure, one small, solid piece at a time. As the weeks turned into a month, the gatehouse was slowly transformed. The gaping hole in the roof was sealed, and the interior, once damp and dark, became dry and filled with the scent of fresh mortar and cut wood. Mr. Thompson's men repointed the entire exterior of the West Tower, filling the gaps between the ancient stones with fresh mortar, making the structure solid and impervious to the wind. Margaret, meanwhile, turned her attention to the interior. She hired a glazier to cut panes of glass for the narrow windows, and she herself learned to set them in new lead casings, a delicate task that required a steady hand. The arrow slit that had once been a gaping hole now held a small, diamond-paned window that let in light but kept out the wind. She cleared the collapsed fireplace, and Mr. Thompson confirmed the flue was sound. Soon, for the first time in over a century, a plume of smoke rose from a chimney at Blackwood Fell. The community of the curious became a community of participants. Her initial hiring of Mr. Thompson had sent ripples through the village. The sight of regular work and the prompt payment of wages earned her a reputation for seriousness that belied her age. Mr. Bell, the carter who had first brought her to Rothley, was now a regular visitor, his cart laden with supplies, bags of lime, sand, nails, timber, and provisions for Margaret herself. He would linger for a cup of tea by her new fire, offering local news and advice. "The old well in the Bailey," he told her one afternoon. "My grandfather said it was the sweetest water in the parish, just needs clearing." Inspired, Margaret spent a week clearing the well, hauling up decades of dirt, stones, and debris until she finally reached the clear, cold water below. The act of drawing fresh water from her own land felt like a miracle. Her presence and her project began to attract others. The local vicar, Reverend Albright, a keen amateur historian, made the climb up to the fell one blustery afternoon. He was fascinated by her story and astounded when she showed him the charter and Sir Alister's letter. He spent hours poring over the documents, his excitement palpable. "This is extraordinary, Miss Vane," he declared, his eyes shining. "This charter predates the county records. It is unimpeachable." He took it upon himself to act as her advocate, presenting a copy of the charter to the magistrate in Alnwick. The claim to the surrounding 3,000 acres, currently held by a distant, disinterested landowning corporation in London that had acquired them piecemeal over the centuries, was now officially contested. The legal battle would be long, but with the original charter, the vicar assured her, the outcome was certain. His belief in her claim gave it a legitimacy that money alone could not buy. One day, Mrs. Davies, the wife of the village shopkeeper, arrived at the gatehouse, slightly out of breath from the climb. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "We see the smoke from your chimney in the village," she said, her smile warm and genuine. "I thought you might appreciate a hot meal." Inside the basket was a steaming steak and kidney pie, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, and a pot of her own blackberry jam. It was a simple gift, but it was an act of profound welcome. Margaret was no longer the strange girl who bought the ruin. She was Miss Vane of the Fell, a fixture in the local landscape, a woman who was not just occupying a place, but making one. She hired a local girl, Mary, the carter's daughter, to help her 2 days a week with cleaning and cooking, creating the first small semblance of a proper household. The gatehouse was no longer a shelter. It was becoming a home, built not just of stone and timber, but of these quiet, accumulating acts of work and kindness. A year passed. Autumn returned to Northumberland, painting the bracken on the fells in shades of rust and gold. Margaret stood at the newly glazed window of her sitting room, the larger chamber on the first floor of the restored gatehouse tower. A fire of seasoned oak logs crackled in the hearth, its hearthstone laid by Mr. Thompson, and its iron fireback, a piece from Sir Alister's cache, depicting a hunting scene. The room was simply furnished with pieces she had commissioned from the village carpenter, solid and unadorned. The walls were newly plastered, the color a warm, creamy white, and the wide oak floorboards, salvaged from a less damaged section of the great hall, were polished to a soft sheen. The air smelled of wood smoke, beeswax, and the stew simmering over the fire for her supper. Outside, the bailey was no longer a wilderness of nettles. In the shadow of the great keep, she had established a large, orderly kitchen garden. Neat rows of cabbages, leeks, and carrots were thriving in the dark soil, protected from the wind by a low stone wall she and Ben, the mason's apprentice, had built from fallen rubble. The sweet water from the old well made the garden flourish. Her life had found its rhythm, dictated by the seasons and the steady demands of her expanding project. The legal claim to the Vane lands was proceeding slowly but inexorably through the courts in London, guided by Reverend Albright's correspondence with an ecclesiastical lawyer. The income from selling a few of the less significant silver pieces provided for the ongoing work and her legal costs. She had begun the consolidation of her home, her fortress. Her stepmother, Amelia, felt like a character from a book she had read long ago. Margaret had received one letter, forwarded by Mr. Hemlock, from the solicitor in Sussex. It informed her that Amelia had remarried to a baronet with more title than sense, and had moved to a grand house in Bath. The letter inquired, with a tone of sharp curiosity, as to Margaret's circumstances. Margaret had not replied. There was nothing to say. Her new life was her reply. She thought more often of Mrs. Gable, wishing she could show the old housekeeper her immaculate account ledgers, the neat columns tracking the cost of every nail and every bag of lime. She wished she could show her the linen she had bought, and the way she had stitched new curtains for the windows, the seams as fine and strong as any Mrs. Gable herself had ever sewn. She had taken the lessons of the servants' hall and used them to rebuild a noble house. On the mantelpiece above the fire she had placed two objects. One was the small wooden wren her father had carved, its head still cocked, listening. She had polished it with beeswax until the grain of the wood glowed. Next to it stood a single silver goblet from Sir Alister's chest, a piece she had polished herself until it shone with a soft lunar light. The wren, a token of a father's gentle love. The goblet, a symbol of an ancestor's fierce hope. They were talismans from two men she had lost, who had nonetheless, across the gulfs of time and death, given her a future. She picked up the goblet. It felt heavy, solid, real. She looked from the warm, contained light of her room to the vast, wild expanse of the fells visible through the window. The land that was, by right, hers. The wind howled outside, the same wind that had chilled her to the bone a year ago. But now, it was just the sound of the world turning outside her strong stone walls. Margaret Vane was 20 years old. A year ago, she had been cast out with £2 and 10 shillings to her name. She had spent 1 sovereign of it on a ruin. It was the best sovereign a woman had ever spent. Thank you for staying with us for the story of Margaret Vane. The things we inherit are not always the things we are given, but sometimes the things we have the courage to find for ourselves. Let us know in the comments what forgotten place or object in your own life holds a story waiting to be uncovered. We're so grateful you're a part of this community, and we look forward to seeing you again.